Welcome everyone. My name is Ding Shi, class of 1993. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, John Davis. John is a globally recognized pioneer and authority on family enterprise and family wealth, and is a creator of the field's most impactful conceptual frameworks, academic courses, and teaching materials. Since the 70s, he has been a leading researcher, advisor, author, and speaker on family enterprise. John has taught and advised enterprising families from more than 65 countries on strategy for multi-generational success of their family, enterprises, ownership groups, and financial wealth. As a senior lecturer at MIT Sloan, he leads the school's family enterprise activities and is launching a new portfolio of family enterprising programs. Today, John joins us as a new MIT Sloan Executive Education faculty member to share the essential ingredients at the heart of multi-generational family enterprise success. The global factor that distributing both business and families, and what this means for future success. Please join me in welcoming John Davis.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Oh, I'm wired, so hi everyone. It's very nice to be here. This is my second official classroom activity since joining the faculty here, and it's a great professional honor to be on the school's faculty, and I've got some really hot ideas to bring to the school, programs to launch, research to do, etc. So I'm going to show you what I've been up to and talk with you about the probably the core question that families that have family companies, family offices, even family foundations, how do you keep them going? How do you sustain these enterprises and the success of your family over generations? It's a perplexing problem because not many families pull it off, okay? But I've been doing this work now both as an academic in schools that I won't mention, and also as an advisor to families for 40 years. And in those 40 years, I've worked in more than 60 countries with families that have little businesses to behemoth businesses, companies that you read about in the newspaper. No matter where you are, you'll read about these leading family companies. They may not always be identified as family companies, but if you're part of that community, you probably know. I've worked with one shareholder, founders, and families that have literally hundreds of family shareholders. Generation 1 to my oldest client is in generation 10 going to 11, but I've studied generation 16, 17, 18. It gets kind of rarefied. All to say that I bring a lot of experience, on the ground experience in academic conceptualizing, research studies, blah, 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 to what we're going to talk about here, which I think really defines the core of what I'm going to be doing or try to do at MIT. So here we are. I look at the world through these, through these lenses, thinking about family enterprise. And today, everybody is talking about this. The forces of change or disruption, which is extreme change and change of a particular kind. And there are lots of types of changes that are affecting business life, but also family life. And the way I organize this is that, and the reason that I came down the river to be here, was because I'm very interested in this and want to make sure that we put our name on the future. And the future of these things is what nags me, kind of gets me spinning on various ideas. When I'm out visiting clients or in conferences, I'm heading off for a 2-week trip now to do that. I'm thinking about these kinds of topics, and I want us here to be able to have something important to say about all of these factors, because they affect the families that own these companies and family offices and foundations and do other important things in the world, and they affect their organizations. So let's dive into part of what I've learned, but also where I think things are going. And I spent, in my 40 years this year, of thinking and working in this field, a good half of it, more than half, was caught up in thinking about how family companies or family businesses themselves survive over time. And what we know is that, and research now is abundant, country by country by country, sector by sector, comparing family companies with non-family companies. Family companies are any kind of organization that are ownership controlled by a single family. Now that typically means majority of the voting shares. But in more than half, probably closer to 60, maybe even 2/3 around the world, but it's over half in the US of all of the publicly traded companies are still family controlled. Like more than half of the New York Stock Exchange is controlled by our family companies that trade their shares on the public market. I'm not sure if you knew that, but because this is a very quiet sector. We don't get, even the news media, over these decades that I've been in this field, I've been prodding business journalists to write more about this sector, and you see more now. Not because of my efforts, but because when I started, there were 5 or 6 of us back in the 70s who thought this was kind of an interesting, cool topic. Now there are literally thousands of people in this field, advising, teaching, researching, etc. So the field has really grown up quite a bit. So the media is catching on, but still, they don't give this sector enough attention and enough credit, by the way. But what we know is that if you compare non-family companies and family companies, and of course, with both, so family companies are these family-controlled organizations. Non-family companies are not controlled or influenced by families. They could be influenced by non-family partners or single entrepreneurs or broader groups. And if you compare non-family to family companies come out better on average. Now there are good ones over here, and all of the, going back to In Search of Excellence to Good to Great or Built to Last, etc. Everybody's interested in the high performers over here. We don't spend very much time looking over here, but if you just look at the averages, family companies perform significantly better in terms of growth, profitability, returns of all kinds, comparing apples to apples, public companies to public family companies to public non-family companies, private family companies to private non-family companies, looking at it per sector, etc. Why? Why do you think that is true? And you may You don't have to agree with the abundant number of studies that has been done on this, but please.
I think in family-run business, there's less of the principal agent problem.
Yeah.
Less of where executives and managers manage the company to their personal interests, and when the family members are involved, they manage the family's interests.
Right. And meaning the owner's interests.
Right.
Yep, please.
I would think that family businesses focus more on the long term as well rather than the short term.
Yeah. And quote unquote long-termism now is this new, have you heard about this? This is like a new big thing that the public companies have latched onto. Public non-family companies have latched onto, thinking, oh my goodness, could it be true? Well, I guess it might be true that if you have a long-term focus, if you plan long-term and think long-term and invest long-term, you're likely to get better results. What a surprising outcome. It only took a lot of these executives, 30 years after we started talking about the advantages of family companies for them to catch up and say, I don't know, maybe they're right. So yeah, long-term, what else?
Quick question, is there a heterogeneity within the family business which is controlled by family but managed by professional managers?
Of course.
Is there heterogeneity between a company owned by, controlled by family, managed by family? Controlled by family and managed by outside management?
Yes.
Is there any difference between the results and performance of these two segments?
Well, in the few studies that have looked at that, separated ownership with management, like in the second generation, we know that family-owned companies managed by non-family executives, and the way you look at that, and they have to look at public data on that because that's where they have a lot of data, you do see some performance advantages. But later than that, you don't see any. Okay, so more needs to be studied on this, but the long-standing attitude about family companies is that they weren't to the right of non-family businesses; they were far to the left. That was the way that they've been looked at for so many years. So what we're studying around family companies actually not only turns conventional management theory on its head, which is fun, but also to unlock some interesting questions about long-term performance and survival that we haven't paid much attention to before. Family companies give us this kind of opportunity. Please, yes, sir.
Just wondering aloud, possibly different expectations in terms of return on capital from the shareholders?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a really important one. Now, what's interesting, even though family companies over the long term perform much better, one of the ironies in well-run family companies is that the ownership group has lower expectations in terms of what they receive, which of course means that you can reinvest more into the company. And what I like to tell my students and clients is that as soon as it becomes about the money, as soon as the real objective of ownership becomes about money, what do I get? You lose your advantages. And if you can preserve that kind of commitment, loyalty, engagement on the part of the family, you gain a real performance edge. Okay, so we know this, but we also know that if you businesses don't survive very long. Today, especially, right? I mean, the statistics that I always cited up until recently were that about 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 7 businesses survive one generation or 25 years. And that was probably true. The latest statistic I saw on this is that it's 1 out of 10. So survivability is becoming more and more challenging. And we can all understand why, but what are some reasons for that, do you think? Why is it harder and harder to survive a long time? What do you think? Please.
Technology, changes in technology.
For one. Yeah, please.
I think the family grows, and so interests expand, and there's a lot more either collaboration needed to determine who's going to drive next.
Yeah.
Or
And that affects after generation one, especially. You can see it in generation one for sure, but those kinds of family factors really influence to the right of the first. Yes, please.
I would say really natural selection as applied to the business. I would expect that in a family-owned business, the process of who leads the company is not as strong as competitive as it could be in a public company, for example. Right? That the successor for the founder is more likely to be his son or daughter than whoever is best fit to succeed that person.
Yeah, so let me play this out a little bit and come back to some more of these family factors. Surviving in a business in any generation today is difficult. But then there are some potential reasons why the family factors can complicate survival even more, right? So if we start with 100 family businesses that have survived one generation, and we take a look at who's around at the end of the second generation, they're only about 30. And then in the next generation, we're down to 15. It cuts in half. The big drop, though, is between generation one and the end of generation two. And then down here, starts leveling out a little bit. Now, and for a variety of reasons, right? Some of these are family factors. Some of these are more business-related factors, management factors, et cetera. Now, what's interesting is that yes, there are complications that families bring to sustainability, but family companies survive twice as long on average as non-family companies. Interesting, huh? So yeah, I mean, any kind of ownership and management model has its pluses and minuses. If you want to go public, there are some pluses, but there are also some minuses. If you want to be in partnership with your buddies, pluses and minuses. With your family, the same thing. So, but on balance, in terms of sustainability and in terms of overall performance, family companies do better. Interesting. Interesting. So, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to do this. Now, as we think about disruptive factors affecting all kinds of businesses, but family businesses, which are the ones I pay attention to, there are some strengths that family companies more typically have. And again, there are good ones and there are bad ones, and a lot of average ones. But they tend to be more long-term in their approach. That is a factor that I think is going to help them. Financial stability, shown in lots of studies, but also in common practice. Family companies tend to have stronger balance sheets. They tend to have lower debt. They tend to save for rainy days more often than do, and more regularly than do non-family companies. Loyalty, which a lot of people are looking for. Quality focus. These factors here tend to be coming up in the rankings. When you do consumer surveys, what are you looking for in a company or in products? This is more and more rising to the top of the list. You take a look at the millennial research, and I'm doing a bunch of that today. These are getting very close to the top. So there are some advantages here, and then there are some vulnerabilities that family companies have. Starting down here, they prefer slower changes. And my big question is, so there's a saying in my field that family companies are slower but better. And my question is, today, can you be slower and better? Or are you going to get really smacked hard by the realities of your market and industry because you don't want to move that far or that fast, and the reluctance to let go of various things, jobs, ownership, decision-making control, getting rid of parts of your company that no longer serve you. That's a big factor here. Loyalty cuts both ways. This operator mindset is endemic in family companies. Now let me tell you what I mean, because I think this is really fundamental to understanding how family companies can survive, and families too. Almost all of the families that I've served are superior, dedicated, talented operators of companies. They really love their businesses, and they are dedicated to quality. Do you know that it's been shown now in several studies, but a couple of really kind of some meta-research that has gone on. Family companies out-innovate non-family companies by far. Isn't that interesting? It's really interesting. But to me, it's not surprising, because you have these operators of family operators who love to tinker with just everything. They want it to be perfect. They want their products to be perfect and services to be perfect, and they love messing around with the processes. They're great innovators. But here's the thing about innovation. A focus on innovation sometimes isn't what you need. Sometimes what you need is not to operate down here making everything perfect, but to think more like owners up here, and to say, what do we want to own? Should we be in this business or that business? Where do we put our capital? What kinds of talent do we need? You got to think more like owners today than like operators. Now, operations always important. You can't disregard anything, but I'm talking about emphasis here. And family companies tend to be too much here and not enough here. Now, in later generations, they get up here more. They get up here. But generations 1 through 3, now, why is that? Well, in part because of this. They have, I used to say that families in business had a control focus. I was wrong. They don't have a control focus, they have a control obsession. And if you need to control every little thing, it's harder to let things go and come up here. Yes, please.
Talk a little bit about what that control obsession, the different ways it manifests itself.
I couldn't really.
Can you talk a little bit about what how that control obsession manifests itself?
Yeah, I mean, there's a control obsession around ownership. We can't let one share out, right? Because then that would interfere with our being able to run this company the way we want to. Well, that's true. But if you need capital to grow and you need external ideas that you need to incorporate in what you're going to do, if the sensible thing would be to create a JV in a new area so that you could launch something new, that control obsession can hold you back because you don't want to share ownership control or operating control. It also, when you're this control obsession also means that it's hard to delegate. You see families and family business leaders, going from here down here in a nanosecond to talk to somebody about the length of the delivery garage. It's like, nothing is outside their purview, right? They'll get involved in anything. And they'll admit it. They'll say everything is important. And when I hear that, my stomach hurts. It's not healthy to think that way. So this control obsession is it's baked in, and it can make family companies falter. Okay, so we're still now talking about the family companies, but here's the big realization, that in today's world, particular businesses come and go, and you gotta just accept that. Now, it doesn't mean that if you have a family company and you can swap out the businesses that are in the family company, you can keep it going for a long time, but the ultimate engine and the ultimate organization here that can survive for generations is the family. The family as an enterprising group that owns things and does things as a group. That's what can survive for generations, and that's what needs to be the focus. Now, it's really hard to switch your focus from the business that the founder created to the family as a value creation organization. Hard to do that. But it's necessary to do that if you want to get past even generation one successfully. You got to start believing that the family itself doesn't mean everybody in the family, because sometimes members of families peel off, right? And you may not want everybody in the family to be an owner going forward. That's legitimate. But family ownership groups as this value creation entity that's where I've ended up. It took me, let's say, 25 years. Please.
What are some of the implications of this?
I'm going to tell you. Any other questions, thoughts at this point before I press on? Because we're going to get exactly to this question. Yeah, George.
Oh, you have good eyesight. The question I have for you is, do you see best-in-class examples of how to mix the two natures of a family business, which capital is by definition illiquid and not accessible to outside participants, and companies that have a liquid capital currency? Michelin, for instance. Michelin is a French group, we all know that, right? Family controlled. But it is a publicly listed company. But I don't see too many examples of this kind of situation where a family group has sort of solved the issue about capital detention in a manner that may add to it the positive aspects of being
Okay, good point. Let me make just a few comments on this. What George is saying is, do you see examples? Tell me if I got it right. Do you see examples of family companies where the family stays in control, but they've got access to outside capital that helps them grow, right? So now, taking your company public has always been like the big step that people do to do this, right? And it gives you, if you perform well, it can give you access to lots of capital. Okay, not many family companies do that, by the way. Only a tiny part of 1% of all of the companies in any economy manage to go public. It's a very small group of companies. And most of the companies that do go public in any country, and we could talk countries all day here, are family companies that choose to go public. So most of the public companies out there are actually family-controlled public companies, right? So that's one way to do it. I don't like it very much. And if I were your advisor, I would accept going public. I would, under certain conditions. Sometimes it's your best choice. Okay, and I'm not irrational about this. I look at what the pros and cons are, but you give up so much when you go public. Information, control, it's so costly. And sometimes you don't get very much out of it, especially after the years go on. Now, are there other ways to get outside capital? Of course there are. Private equity is like the hot thing. Let me tell you something, this broad generalization, but I think I'm right about this. Capital markets were not designed for family companies. They're not family friendly. And so what I've been doing for my clients and with my colleagues is finding very long-term private equity, which is starting to now emerge. I mean, 10 years ago, you could hardly find it at all. Anything over 7 years was like, you really had to hunt to find it. Now I can find 10-year private equity and longer. Sometimes with like sovereign wealth funds, if you have a big enough company, they'll go on for generations, or at least say they will. So capital markets, this is like something that if you need to know about this these days, and it is something we're going to study and really come out with, I think, some very practical advice for families in different situations. Under what conditions do you go public? Under what conditions do you get private equity funding, or merge, or do some other innovative things to raise capital? But I want to, yes, please, right there.
So maybe early to see what the effects of this might be, but do you have any thoughts on the potential effects of blockchain technology in funding for such companies?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, and let me please ignore that question for now because it's a really good question. And if you go back to the future of list, that I showed you in the beginning, I was just talking with some buddies of mine today about this because we were talking about how technology is impacting various things, and I said, well, it's going to impact the capital markets too. It's coming. And they said, well, yeah, that's probably right, we should, and I said, well, we got to find out. We've got to figure this out. So thank you for the question. Stay tuned is what I would say, because it really, it's a very, and if you want to help me on this, let's talk. Yes, please.
Yes. So I was wondering whether there is any difference between family-controlled businesses who actually own both the majority of the voting and the economic rights, and those that own a majority of the voting but only a minority of the economic rights to the company.
Yeah, and again, this is these kinds of ownership structure or ownership design issues are so interesting and so valuable to understand. There is some research on this that shows that the performance of family companies that have a majority of both voting and economic rights is better than when they have the voting control but a small sliver of voting rights, that performance tends to slide, okay? And we could explain that in a number of ways, but this is more of what, in this next chapter of my career, I want to be able to make very accessible to my students, right? So if I can, with your permission, let me just press on here because I've got some more interesting stuff to show you. And I've only got 20 minutes. Now, so if you say, okay, so if the family is the ultimate organization, if that should be the focus of our attention, well, how do you keep families going over generations? So it leads to this. In every country, there's one of these. What's called a 3-generation rule. And it says essentially, they say it in different ways. Every country says it in different ways. And every country, gosh, do I have the German? No, the German one is very clever, play on words. And some of these go back hundreds of years. So society figured out a long time ago that families that become rich don't stay rich for very long. Now, but when you think about it, 3 generations is about 75 years. That's not nothing, okay? But in the scheme of things, over time, families tend to fall from grace, is the idea here. And do we know that this is true? Well, the last 12 years of my life have been spent on this. Interesting question. And this is what I can tell you now, that the 3-generation rule is largely right, as far as I can see. And there are no databases that go out over 3+ generations where you can track families and their wealth over a long period of time to see if it kept going up or fell, and then to try to understand why. So you have to look at cases. And you take lots of cases and you line them up and you say, what are the patterns? And the patterns go like this. Most wealth, first of all, most wealth is built through owning operating companies. Most wealth is built that way. In one sample that I've got, Forbes list sample, more than 85% of the families that get to the Forbes list get there originally because they had an operating business or two. Now, are there other ways of becoming wealthy? Yes. You can be an inventor and invent something really great and then sell it or market it, etc. But even there, if you choose to market it, it's a company, right? But you could sell it, or you could be J.K. Rowling, one of my favorite examples, and write the Harry Potter books. And now, you can't be a business school professor who writes business books and become really wealthy. I figured that one out. Don't try it. It's not worth it. But so 85% of the families that do this do it because they have operating companies. And hard work, a good idea, a little luck, meets an expanding market opportunity, and this happens. And once that happens, what's next? Well, the most likely pattern that we see is this one, that wealth does fall over a few generations. I'll show you an example of this. Personally, I think 60–70% of the families at least do this, but some do this. Some lose it quickly. It crashes, it falls like a rock in a short period of time. I think maybe around 20% are there. You can do the math, and then you have the rest up here that regenerate their wealth generation over generation. And what I've been doing, is looking at these examples and trying to figure out, why does the 3-generation rule happen? It's such a common thing, and the explanation is really pretty simple, or it can be said simply. What happens is that your assets, companies, slow down in their growth or decline. Your assets start to shrink, but your consumption of assets continues to grow. That's the simple calculus, okay? So your company starts to slide, but your family's growing, the expenses of the family's growing, the consumption of the capital that you need for your company is reduced, your company slides more, and eventually it goes away. And then the question up here, of course, is, well, when you see that happen, for gosh sakes, why don't you do something about it? It's a good question. So why don't you do something about it? When you see your family's capital eroding, why doesn't somebody blow the whistle and say, let's get together and figure out how to stop this? We're going to lose all our money. So why doesn't that happen? Human irrationality. Did you graduate from this school? Okay. So, yeah, human irrationality. Well, that's just like saying because we're human. But why else? You're right, of course, because you're not looking at the data and saying, let's fix the problem. Yeah. So does it just mean that we're crazy and we let bad things happen to us? True, okay. But beyond that, what goes on in families where we don't do something about this? Please.
I think if you grow up wealthy, you don't have the same work ethic as somebody who didn't grow up as wealthy, and so by the third generation, you've had a ton of wealth. The work ethic isn't there, and then there's this family loyalty that kind of gets in the way of making, maybe the smartest business decision as far as who should be leading a company or organization.
Okay. So we may not have a strong work ethic. If we don't have a strong work ethic, we may not have certain capabilities, right, to allow us to figure this out. Family loyalty, we've got to kind of close together and pretend like we're okay. So is that?
Yeah, just not, I mean, in a non-family-owned business, you're more likely to just fire someone if they're not performing. In a family-owned business, you're more likely to do that.
Yeah, okay. So it's harder to make. This goes back to the letting go difficulty. If my brother or niece or whomever is running the company, it's a little harder to let them go. It's a little harder even to shut down this factory or sell it off and pocket what we can and move on. It's hard for families to do that. And yet, you're going to need to know how to do that. And as a matter of fact, switching gears only slightly, part of why one reason this happens, this quick descent thing can happen for all kinds of reasons, all kinds. There can be a natural disaster or a war. I know families from Venezuela that have lost tons because of what's gone on there politically. Things that are largely out of your control. Now you can try to notice it early and get out of Dodge before bad things happen, etc. But even tragic accidents can happen. Things happen. But then families also can make some really bad choices. Really bad choices. And family wars can also take a family down. I have cases on that. And then also really bad economic decisions, like this one. A family's doing well. And one of the relatives, one of the younger brothers, wants his chance to be a captain of industry. And the family feels, well, yeah, we like him, and he sure seems interested, so yeah, take this capital and go do what you think is best. Because his brother got that opportunity, and he did really well. So the second brother shows up, they give him a pile of capital, and he goes off and buys a bad company in a dying industry. Now, if you've graduated from this school, you would know that that's not a good thing to do, right? But they let him do it. And why did they let him do it? Because he's our brother. And we want to give him a chance. Fairness means we treat him equally with the older brother, even though he's a faint comparison to his older brother in terms of skill and knowledge and whatever. So first couple of years, he loses money, and everybody says, well, and he says, I need to get started. And then after 4 years, he's losing more money. And the two sisters that own this business with their two brothers are starting to panic. They have sense. And still he says, well, just give me another year because I know I can turn this around. Have you ever heard that before in families? Just give me another year. I know I can make this successful. I just need another year. I wish I had $1 for every time I've heard that said in a family. And so anyhow, year 6, they've now lost about 30% of their overall wealth. And they've basically got a scrap heap of a company to sell off in a fire sale. But eventually, with some intervention, they said, okay, time out, right? Families are terrible at this. They're not even bad, they're terrible. They're terrible at stopping losses like this or getting out of bad decisions. So the same tenacity that makes them really resilient can really injure them. So anyhow, this is a pattern of slowing growth, increasing consumption. This happens for a variety of reasons. I'll give you an example of the 3-generation rule first. This is the most famous one, the Vanderbilts, the first big wealthy family in the U.S. Commodore creates a shipping line. His son Billy, who Dad didn't like very much in spite of his extraordinary sideburns, and he does great and sells off the ships and invests in trains at the right time. 3rd generation did a very good job scaling, but then this is what happened. So Cornelius, Billy's sons, he had 4 sons and 4 daughters, and wealth takes off like a rocket ship. They all buy palaces or build palaces in Manhattan. There were 10 of them at one time. And nobody in the next generation, in the 4th generation, could afford to live in them because between 1900, when they sold the business, because they were afraid of regulation, and 1920, they lost about 10 billion. That's 500 million a year. That's over $1.5 million a day that they blew through. I know, isn't that? You have to admire that level of consumption. I mean, that's hard to do. That's really hard to do. But they did it. They did it. They were good. They were good at that. Now they also did some good things like establish Vanderbilt University and endow hundreds of public libraries, etc. But yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. So, but that was decreasing returns, increasing consumption. This, of course, happens for a lot of reasons. Now, what about this? Here's a good example. A family that I've known for a long time. They're now in generation 7. I met this guy a long time ago. And they started, and this gives you a good example of how wealth is built over a long period of time. Starting back in the 1830s, they get into water, bottled water, quickly move into soft drinks and later beer. And then, we're advancing the clock a lot, they were very entrepreneurial. And they knew how to read markets. Now, they're in little Finland. And Finland has about 5 million people. About half of them are in Helsinki. And they have no choice in Finland but to think internationally. So from day one, this is an international company focused mostly in Finland, but later they get into Germany, they later get into Russia. Before the wall comes down, they had about 30% market share in Russia. Pretty good. Of course, the Russians were just awful at business at that point. So, and then they realized that they're not big enough. Look at this. In 2000, they're in little Finland, Hartwell is the 5th largest beverage company in the world. Isn't that amazing? I mean, that's really, and you walk into their factories, their distribution centers, state of the art. So this is a family that understood how to diversify, how to scale, how to reinvent themselves over a period of time, staying pretty close to their knitting, beverages. And still, they understand here, right after 2000, that everything, what's happening in the world economy, the beer business is consolidating like crazy. So they try what they can. They merge with Scottish and Newcastle, and then they later sell out to Heineken, exit. They start an investment platform, a family investment company. They give 50% of the sale proceeds to the family and invest 50% as a family. And then almost all of the 50% that they distributed comes back to the investment company, individuals and families saying, no, we're going to stick with the family. They didn't go out, they bought boats and bigger cars, a little bit, but not too much of that. And so this is what we're seeing. And I'm going to move quickly now. So that's how it's done over a long period of time. And what we see is that these 3 factors signal sustainable success, but also if you're not doing these 3 things right, you get into trouble leading to declines. And so growth, you have to keep growing faster than you consume your assets, duh. But it does mean that both things are important, right? Growing assets and not consuming assets are important. And by the way, if you had to choose between those 2 things to protect your assets, being really good at growing or really good at not consuming, which is a safer alternative? No, not consuming. All kinds of mistakes, honest mistakes, can be made when you try to grow your assets. But get really good at not consuming them, you have a much higher chance of compounding. So most businesses grow like this, right? You're growing in a normal way. You go through the growth cycle. You realize things are going to slow down. So you diversify into something, typically something related. A market that you know about well, or another kind of extension of your product line. It's exactly the Hartwell story. Now, so scaling and related diversification is what we see when we look at the last 150 years of companies. But there are families that do it in a bolder way. Like Hugo Stenbeck invests in forestry and agriculture. It's the 1930s. His son Jan says, I don't like those businesses. I'm going to get into steel, auto, and telecom. He dies early, poor guy, in his 50s. Appoints his daughter, Christina, who is just in her 20s. She studies things, and in her 30s, makes a big move, gets out of dad's businesses into entertainment and e-commerce. So this is a bolder path, but I think we're going to see more of this because of disruption in the future. Now, disruption looks like this. You're on a life cycle. This is in your industry. Boom, drops, and you have to climb a new life cycle. And families are going to have to get used to this and be able to be very agile. And I'll move quickly at this point to get to my punchline here. And you have to think about yourself as stewards of assets and values. And you need a compelling family mission to keep this family flexible and continue to pursue growth and adding value in various ways. But this gives you a lot of latitude. And this is what we're trying to encourage here with families that will come to us, and part of what we're going to try to do is to focus more broadly than just business leadership on developing wealth creators. All of these kinds of roles are important, potentially important, but this one is something that I've identified over time as being essential. And there are 3 different flavors of wealth creators. All of them can add value, and you need to figure out what you need, but also what you have in your family. And unity, of course, is vital to be able to sustain all of this. And so I'm going to leave you with my 10 suggestions. They're not exactly commandments, but I don't feel like I've got quite the authority to say that these are commandments, but they are good suggestions. And if any of you want these slides, I'm happy to distribute them. I think that we will. David, are we going to do that automatically, or can we do that? Yep. Okay, great. So let me just say, in the interest of time, because I have to split for the airport, the first thing that the school and I decided to do was to launch 2 programs. One for later generation families. It's coming up in October. There's some information on your desk on this. Please take this. Please bring your families to these programs. And one for founder families that'll be in the new year. And I'm looking forward to interacting much more with the great alumni group of this school and being around for a while, hopefully doing some interesting things with you all. So thank you very much. Thank you.